Hi, I'm Jen, and welcome to Christian Fire Poppy. Today we are going to be discussing the possibility of what I keep thinking of, and that is 7 years of lean Kine ahead. Is that a possibility? The signs I've been thinking about and looking at, the connections and signs of timing, some of them have to do with not just the 7 years in regards to the solar eclipse, but some very, very interesting timing coincidences tying the Pons Brooks comet into the War of 1812. And that was when Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner in the beginning of America. And there's a lot, so let's just get into it. One of the first tells that really caught my attention was March 25th, 2020, was the day that the church announced that all the temples would be closed due to the big events of 2020. And what do you know, March 25th, on the 4-year anniversary, this is the day that it was announced that the bird flu had jumped into cattle and was spreading and making them sick. So you can see down here below, this article says the U.S. Department of Agriculture first reported on March 25th that a cow and milk from 2 dairies in Texas tested positive for bird flu, along with milk from 2 dairies in Kansas. The agency later confirmed cases in additional herds in Texas, New Mexico, Michigan, and Idaho. There were a lot of other interesting events that happened on March 25th, 2024. This was the day the Kirtland Temple opened. This was also the first of 3 Purim Esther lunar eclipses. These are lunar eclipses that occur on the Jewish feast day of Purim. So that is a celebration of Esther. And you think about the theme of Esther, a faithful woman who saved a nation. On this day, the St. George Temple reopened again, and there were some troubling things happening in the nation. Trump's $464 million bond came due on this day. Less than 24 hours after this eclipse, the Francis Scott Key Bridge disaster happens. And there are a lot of interesting things that tie into this big event. We'll get into that soon. So the last year, when I was doing my interview with Christian Homestead in 2023, and I talked about Holy Day stacking, the Kirtland Temple, timing, the 7 years of the church getting higher, holier wings. I also mentioned watching the bird flu progression. So let me show you just a little clip to remind you what we were thinking a year ago.
It's interesting because whatever God's doing, Satan always has his twisted version of the plan. So if the church is getting their wings, then you look at the wings of war are also up in the sky. And also, apparently, you guys have probably heard about the bird flu that's going all the troubles with eggs and the chickens, but apparently it's mutated in a way so that it's now spreading from mammal to mammal, killing off thousands of sea lions and other animals. So you can look that up. It's just you Google sea lions in South America dying from the bird flu. And another interesting thing that you could also Google is this is a Forbes article. So in Forbes, they cite an experiment from 2012 in which scientists were doing gain of function, modified a deadly bird flu virus in order to make it possible for the bird flu to transmit directly between mammals. So you have this, anyways, here have any, I see parallels right of the 2020 time. And
So the bird flu in cattle has just begun, and it has already spread to 6 states in just 1 week. It's pretty concerning. So you can see here in this article, April 4th, bird flu has infected a dairy herd in Ohio for the first time and was detected in additional herds in Kansas and New Mexico, expanding an outbreak in cows that has raised concerns about possible risks to humans. So we have confirmed infections in herds across 6 states. That's a lot of spread in just 1 week. We also have the USDA tightly regulates avian flu virus strains that are deadly to poultry, requiring culling of entire flocks. We've had this going on for a while. if they find one bird that tests positive, they will cull and put down millions of poultry, and they pay the farmers even more money, a lot of money, to do this. That's concerning to think about what type of policies might be put in place with sick cattle. Already, we have this news. It's again less than a week. Utah implements new restrictions amid possible avian flu outbreak in cattle. So sometimes the reaction to the problem can cause even more problems than the problem itself. I'm thinking about inflation and restrictions and see. So when I think about these sick cattle, it just keeps reminding me of the Joseph of Egypt story with the lean kine, the sick cows. So in 2011, investigators at the University of Wisconsin in Japan and in Netherlands learned how to engineer the H5N1 virus, that's the bird flu, to move between mammals. This kind of change is called gain of function because it allows the virus to do things it could not do before. So the CDC has a page all about this because this has been an ongoing controversy for years, and no one has been able to stop them from continuing to do gain of function research, allowing this virus to spread more easily from mammal to mammal. So, dual use research of concern and bird flu questions and answers. What agents, toxins, categories of research experiments fall under the category of DURC? Top of the list is highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. This is on the CDC's webpage. The question is, has CDC done gain-of-function research on highly pathogenic avian flu, H5N1, in the past? Yes, CDC has conducted gain-of-function research in the past. So these viruses are part of pandemic preparedness efforts. So in 2006, the CDC conducted an experiment that sought to understand how the bird flu virus might become more transmissible in mammals. So they're making it more contagious. The study assessed the ability of highly pathogenic bird flu viruses to mix with human flu viruses through a process called reassortment. So that can result in the creation of new viruses with pandemic potential. So they're creating super bird flu viruses that are meant to be highly contagious and jump from mammals to mammals instead of staying just within birds. Wonderful, right? Sound like a familiar story? So, Forbes has come out with a lot of articles on this. One is scientists developing deadly bird flu mutations agree to pause research. This was in 2012 when there was a big controversy. They paused for a short time, but then picked it right back up. Virologists object to any new restrictions on dangerous gain of function research. And you can see over here, Steven Salzberg has talked a lot about trying to convince and put out information why this should be stopped. He says the goal of the research is to detect when the virus may mutate in the wild and spark a pandemic. According to an AP report, researchers found it easier than previously thought to develop mutations that allow the virus to transmit from mammal to mammal. So in this case, they were infecting ferrets. The potential problem is that the research has led to a formula for the mutated virus, which could theoretically be leaked and find its way into the hands of bioterrorists. In another scenario, a lab accident could result in the inadvertent release of the virus. So, in this article, it also says strains have the potential to cause a worldwide pandemic. So isn't that wonderful? Another article, this is USA Today, it says lab created bird flu virus accident shows lacks oversight of risky gain of function research. It's a whole article about how they were putting this virus into ferrets, and then there was an accident that happened and it was mishandled. And they don't believe that this was the start of anything, but it was just a red flag showing that when you're messing around with these types of dangerous viruses, it's very easy to have human error and for these viruses to get out. And that's a problem. So, just a little reminder about all the interesting things that happened on March 25th. So, again, these are the times where we have extremely good things happening and extremely bad things. Um, you can see here on March 25th, the lunar eclipse is over this area, and we have these 3 Purim or Esther lunar eclipses. That reminds me that when I think about this, I just think about how Esther was such a great example. Her story shows that there's always hope and that with faith, God can save a nation even when it appears to be unsavable. So if we remember back to this interesting timing, the parallels in 2020, when we look at 4 years exactly from that date, that puts us to the 4th Palm Sunday weekend, and we had the Hosanna shout. Here we had the Kirtland Temple opening again, and we talked about how this was Nisan 10. We have each of these Palm Sunday, Passover, 10th of Nisan, and General Conference weekend lining up during 2020, and then also during this period of time. And within that year, on that Palm Sunday, we have a lot of interesting things happening. So I find it interesting that between March 25th, 2020 to March 25th, 2024, the exact 4-year time gap reminds me of that Nisan 10 time, the 10 to the 14th, 4-day preparation for Passover. So time to hear him and tie the lamb to the bedpost. So getting ready for Passover events. Greatest miracles. So on April 8th, 2024, we have the eclipse that crosses right over Little Egypt. And the next 7-year eclipse is an X over the Israel area. This is, again, 2 eclipses 7 years apart over the Israel area. So interesting parallel to the X marks the spot over America. Then we have X marks the spot over Israel area, specifically over the Red Sea. So again, this idea of here we have like Moses, Little Egypt, and the next one is over the Red Sea. So as I was thinking about this idea of Joseph of Egypt's dream, the 7 years of plenty with the fat kine or the fat cows versus the 7 years of famine or the lean kine or the sickly cows, it's just an interesting visual, the way that the eclipses are set up in the sense that we have 7 eclipse years that ends on this date, April 8th, 2024, this eclipse right here. That's on Nisan 1, meaning the Jewish New Year day. So you think of something new, the idea that things are changing, and time will tell, but it's interesting to look at as we see what happens that perhaps these next 7 years may be the beginning of a time of lean kine. And if that's true, then having the bird flu within the cattle would be a pretty telltale sign if that were to be the case. The other possibility is you look at these little sections here, 1,211 days. So each of these, this is 7 years here, 7 eclipse years. This is 7 eclipse years, but also this is 7 eclipse years. So it could also be 7 years of plenty to the eclipse and then a time of transition followed by 7 years of lean kine starting at the Red Sea eclipse. So we have our first Red Sea eclipse right here, and then 7 years later, our second Red Sea eclipse right here. So the Pons-Brooks eclipse, which is predominantly called the Devil Comet, is brightest on April 21st, 2024, And at perihelion, the closest point to the sun, there's also a Jupiter and Uranus conjunction right next to it, 21 degrees in Taurus the bull. So again, we have this bull or cow imagery, and we have 12P Pons Brooks right here, and we have a Jupiter Uranus conjunction right there. Remember that Jupiter was planet that was within the womb of the woman for 9 months within Virgo, so the Revelation 12 sign in 2017. And that was very near the first solar eclipse. So if you look at the eclipse as marking 7 years, it's kind of interesting. So April 21st is also the last day of Nisan 10 Passover prep time. So it's Nisan 13, and it's the day before Passover begins. It's also the day that the Manti Temple is being rededicated. So another interesting way to view what's happening with Pons Brooks is that 7 years after the Revelation 12 sign in 2017, where Jupiter circled in the womb of Virgo for 9 months. And now we have a dragon. So right here, this article says Moon will soon hang out with Mother of Dragons comet, calling it that because it has a tail, it has horns. So they're calling it a devil comet, dragon comet. So we have a dragon devil comet with horns and a tail, and it looks like it's chasing Jupiter. Look, so the day of the eclipse, it's near Venus. You'll also be able to see the comet Pons Brooks near the Jupiter planet. So in Revelation 12:4, it says, "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to the earth." So that imagery just makes me think of comets. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered for to devour her child as soon as it was born. So the Revelation 12 imagery in the sky had Virgo, the woman, giving birth to the child Jupiter. And now we have the dragon chasing the child. It's like great visuals to go along with our scriptures. So the Pons Brooks comet becomes brightest. So, and it's not only really bright, but it's also at perihelion at the start of Passover. Something interesting that I just learned is pons actually means bridge. So it means bridge in Latin. So pons meaning bridge and brooks meaning water made me think of how a bridge over water allows us to pass over the water. So we have an overpass, we pass over the water. So bridge over water comet. Now, that immediately made me think about how we had a big bridge over water disaster. And I did a whole video about this and some weird, interesting tie-ins about how this was 128 days after Biden's birthday, 120 days before Francis Scott Key's birthday, and this was the Francis Scott Key Bridge that was destroyed. He was the one who wrote the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem. Feels like a pretty big sign to me. So there's so many tie-ins to 12 Pons Brooks Comet and Francis Scott Key and the Star Spangled Banner. So the War of 1812 and 12P Pons Brooks Comet discovery. So just to give you a little background, unlike the American Revolution, the cause of the War of 1812, they were far more economically and politically motivated than idealistic. Does that sound anything like our wars today? So the 12P Pons Brooks, the comet was discovered on July 12, 1812. And it's pretty interesting because on July 12, 1812, this was a big day in the War of 1812. So on this day, U.S. forces under General Hull invaded Canada. And the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain was ignited by British attempts to restrict U.S. trade. Thinking about trade and the supply chain, again, it makes me think about the bridge incident or there's a lot more to tie into that. So the 12P Pons-Brooks Comet, the bridge over water comet, you might say, the national anthem, and the War of 1812. How do these all tie in? Well, 12P Pons-Brooks Comet, it had its first perihelion after it was discovered in 1812, and that was September 15, 1812. Well, September 15th, that is the same day the Battle of Baltimore ended. That was the big finish of the War of 1812, and at least for the Battle of Baltimore, that is, and the original national anthem day. So we have perihelion after Ponsbrook was discovered in 1812 on September 15, 1812. And soon in 2024, we're going to have the perihelion again right before Passover. So the Star Spangled Banner, the original manuscript by Francis Scott Key, was on September 15th, 1814. So the Star Spangled Banner original manuscript. And you can see here that the Battle of Baltimore ended on September 15th. So this was between British and American forces in the War of 1812. So the resistance of Baltimore's Fort McHenry during bombardment by the Royal Navy inspired Francis Scott Key to compose the poem Defense of Fort McHenry, which later became the lyrics for the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem of the United States. And here in this year, when Ponsbrooks is showing its face in the skies again, we have the destruction of the symbol for the Francis Scott Key Bridge or the Star Spangled Banner. Kind of interesting. So Ponsbrooks perihelion on September 15, 1812, during the 1812 War. September 15th was Francis Scott Key's Star Spangled Banner original manuscript day and the last day of the Battle of Baltimore. So not only was it September 15th, but the Star Spangled Banner as the national anthem, so Key, he was inspired by the large U.S. flag with 15 stars and 15 stripes on September 15th. So crazy that the Francis Scott Key Bridge was destroyed while Pons Brooks is back again in 2024. Another interesting parallel to when Pons Brooks was discovered and in the sky. So in 1812, this was that time of the New Madrid earthquake. And it's interesting because now it's back right before the solar eclipses that cross over the New Madrid fault area. So right here. So Pons-Brooks Comet, it passed perihelion September 15th and was visible to the unaided eye for 3 months in 1812. And the Great Comet and New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812. So during this time of 1811 and 1812, we had very interesting things happening with comets and the New Madrid earthquakes, including the Pons-Brooks Comet. So another interesting comet at this time was the Napoleon Comet that was seen as a portend of war with Russia. And there are some connections with this date and the Pons-Brooks Comet and war with Russia again. So September 15th in 1812, this was the day that Napoleon invades Russia. So on September 15th, the perihelion reminds me that God's hand is over the rise and fall of nations. So whatever the case, it says early on September 15th, Napoleon entered an almost completely deserted Moscow. The population, about 262,000 in 1812, had left with only 10,000, some of whom were wounded soldiers remaining. By midday, he had set up his headquarters in the Kremlin. So, kind of weird that on the same exact day, September 15th, 1812, we had the perihelion day, And that was also the day that Napoleon invades Russia. So the first fires broke out in the evening. There was more wind and massive fires. And I guess April 21st, 2024, brilliant as that comes, we have a lot of conflict going on with Russia in the world. It reminds me that God chooses who will fall and who will be passed over in global conflict. All right, one other connection. So July 20th, the 12P Pons Brooks first big flare is on the same day that Russia destroys 60,000 tons of grain from the bread basket of Europe. Now, in my previous video, I had shown how I saw this Francis Scott Key Bridge being destroyed as a fig tree symbol. We have the fig trees are symbols of Israel, and the broken bridge was the Francis Scott Key. So being kind of a symbol of America and what happened then to think about. But fig trees fed people then, and this boat was all about the supply chain. So we have that being destroyed. So if we think about this concept of the lean kine, the lean grain in Genesis 41, it says, and behold, 7 thin ears and blasted with the east winds. This is part of the 7 years of famine. So what Russia's grain deal action means for Ukraine. So it's just showing here that on July 20th, they destroyed 60,000 tons of grain. This is the breadbasket of Europe. So why is Devil Comet flaring up with horns? On July 20th, an unexpected brightness outburst again caused it to briefly become about 100 times brighter. So as the comet moved closer to the sun, it undergoes periodic outbursts, but the first outburst was on July 20th, 2023. So it's kind of interesting how this comet seems to be tied into these wars and with Francis Scott Key and the Star Spangled Banner and this idea of the lean kine. So the grains and the cows. The 2020 Passover time was peak COVID plague time. So will there be a 2024 parallel with bird flu and cattle now? Well, we're nearing Passover and the perihelion is on April 21st. Passover starts April 22nd. And within just a short amount of time, this bird flu and cattle situation, it's very much being downplayed by the mainstream media. But at the same time, if you remember what happened in 2020, everything was just a big underreaction, and then immediate overreaction. And then it was mostly the response to the situation that made things get even worse. So not a great situation. So just have to wait and see what happens, but it does seem like kind of a warning sign to me. This year, Passover falls at the beginning of April. So this is in 2020. It says smack in the middle of what some experts estimate will be the peak. And I do remember that the coronavirus, that pandemic was peaking at that time. I just remember thinking how interesting that was for that to be happening during Passover. It's the power of Passover during a plague. So looming signs of lean kine, lean grain, and 12P Pons Brooks Devil Comet. So it's kind of interesting because notice 12P Pons Brooks also that it was discovered on July 12th, but it's also tied to the 1812 war. So you have all these 12s. It's a flashpoint day of the 1812 war. That was the attack on Canada. You have the 12P Pons Brooks perihelion, September 15th, 1812. So it reaches perihelion, the closest point to the sun. And on this day, Napoleon invades Moscow. The fire of Moscow is fueled with hurricane strength winds, and 2/3 of the city's burned. So things looked really bad for Russia at that time. But it almost seemed like an act of God with the weather, the fires, the winds, and then the very terrible cold Russian winters that immediately flushed Napoleon out of Moscow. So September 15th, 1814, you have the 1812 war. It inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star Spangled Banner. It's also the day that the Baltimore battle ends. Then exactly 210 years later, get that 12 backwards. That might be a bit of a stretch, but all these 1, 2 numbers. March 26, 2024, Francis Scott Key Bridge, oops, I misspelled that, is destroyed. And you have the 12 Ponds Brooks is visible in the sky at this time. April 8th, 2024 is going to really showcase the Pons Brooks Comet. So we have this green-horned dragon comet with a tail, also called a devil comet. It is going to look like it's almost chasing Jupiter during the solar eclipse, and this is happening 7 years after the first solar eclipse across America. And that first solar eclipse was right after the Revelation 12 sign in 2017, where Jupiter was in the womb of Virgo for 9 months. And this day on April 8th is Nisan 1, or the Jewish New Year. So are we looking at a new 7 years, but a change in providence? We'll see. April 21st, 2024, we have the 12 Ponds Brooks reaches perihelion. And this is the day before Passover or the end of the Nisan 10 prep time. So Nisan 13, we have bird flu and cattle during this time. And I wouldn't be surprised if this was a gain of function disaster once again. And I really hope not. I really hope that I am just looking into this and making erroneous connections, and that all of this will just fizzle out and turn out to be nothing. But at the very least, even when these connections do, if they do turn out to be erroneous and don't mean anything, we can always extract from these connections, taking the stories of the scriptures that we're talking about and applying it to our lives, and using it to remember and think about the stories and the messages and the principles. So always take away the principles. That is the most important thing. Not to go run wild with the connections, but to use the connections to drive those principles deeper into our heart. So as we think about the story of Passover, it's really more than a historical event. It's a timeless lesson that can speak to us today. So in the Exodus narrative, we witness the plight of the Israelites. They're oppressed and enslaved in Egypt until their cries for freedom reach the heavens. And then in response, God intervenes through Moses, leading his people out of bondage. So Passover serves as this great beacon of hope, reminding us that even in our darkest hours, even in our nation's darkest hours, God hears our cries and he responds with compassion and deliverance. And it teaches us that no matter the obstacles we face, God is with us, guiding us through the wilderness towards that promised land. So just as God provided for the Israelites, he will continue to provide for us today. So the Passover, it reminds us to trust in God's faithfulness, knowing that he will never abandon us. It challenges us to have faith even when the path ahead seems very uncertain. So we have to remember we serve a God who will always make a way even when there seems to be no way. So regardless of what is coming in the future and what is happening, we know that we have a God that we can trust and that we can rely on our Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave the ultimate sacrifice. I'm so grateful for the blood that he shed, and that through his blood and his grace, he paid the price and he made the way that all those things might pass over us if we'll just turn to him. So I just want to remind you guys to join the goal to finish reading the Book of Mormon by April 8th. There's not very many days left, but we can continue to be consistent and read the Book of Mormon every day, and we can go even beyond April 8th. So thank you so much for joining me today. Let's bloom despite the doom and gloom like a true fire poppy. A Zion field of many fire poppies will reduce erosion after world chaos fires. Join us for more fiery passion and preparedness as we fly into the second coming of Jesus Christ.